everyone, thank you for coming. It's great to see you all here. I'm Marie, I'm an artist in Mudlark and 1/3 of the Mudlarking events group along with Jason and Monica and Jason, hands-on history. And together we bring a really large community of over 80 Mudlarks together to deliver yearly exhibitions, talks, walks and events like this one during the Totally Thames Festival month and beyond. So this is the 3rd year in a row we've partnered with Royal Museums Greenwich to bring mudlarking into a large national institution to encourage discourse and further explore how mudlarking and material culture connects us to people and place, both past and present. So, in this discussion, we will share ideas, stories, and histories of the river, community and identity, learned and found through mudlarking, river walking, research and artistic practice. Now, before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to our panel guests and our chair, and then I'll take a back seat. So please welcome Malcolm Russell, going to you first. Malcolm is a history writer and mudlark, and the author of Mudlarked. He uses found artefacts to reveal the stories of a diverse array of London's unremembered people. Currently, he's completing an MA in modern history with a focus on the history of gender, sexuality, race, and empire. Next, Remiiya Badru. Remiiya is an artist and river rambler. Her deep fascination with the spiritual essence of the river and holistic approach to the art of walking reflects the river's forever-changing palette of scent, sound, colour and surface, colonial and post-colonial human narratives, industrial change, heritage and development. Right, next we've got Dr. Aleema Gray. So, Aleema is a Jamaican-born curator, researcher and public historian. Her practice is driven by a concern for more historically contingent ways of understanding the present, especially regarding notions of belonging, memory, and contested heritage. Come over here. Then we've got Tom Chivers. Tom is a writer, researcher, arts producer, and mudlark, and the author of London Clay. He's currently completing a postgraduate research project entitled In the Flow of Things, Encounters with the Mudlarks of the Thames Foreshore. Our chair for the evening is Ben Weddell. Ben is a collaborative doctoral partnership student at the National Maritime Museum and the University of Reading. He's researching shared identities within early modern maritime communities. I also need to say a little bit more. He previously worked in the museum learning team and was responsible for various projects involving mudlarking. So as a result, somewhere in the museum's collection centre in Kidbrooke, there sits a small green and purple plastic sheep found on the Deptford foreshore. So whilst not a mudlark himself, Ben is mudlark adjacent. So without further ado, let's get going. Hand over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Capisark, everyone. So the first question I wanted to kind of ask everyone was really thinking about a kind of general thing about stories and how mudlarking and how the river can be used to tell stories, particularly the Thames, London, and Londoners' stories. So why do we think that mudlarking and the river are useful for telling these stories of people? I'm just going to start with nearest me. Malcolm, I think you saw this coming, didn't you? I'll ask that question to Malcolm first of all. So why is mudlarking useful for telling stories of people?
Okay, thanks for dropping me in that.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll just get one down there. Okay, my sort of immediate thought in answer to that question draws on something that I put in introduction to my book. The way I think about the Thames foreshore, and I guess the river more broadly and its environment, is it's really an archive. And if you're going to write, or most historians, if they're going to produce a piece of history writing, they typically start with an archive, and that typically consists of a bunch of printed, written records in some boxes in a county records office or something like that. And that's fine, and obviously a lot of amazing historical stories are written that way. But the Thames and the Thames foreshore is different. It's a different kind of archive. I mean, I could waffle on about this for 20 minutes, but I'm going to take about 10 more seconds. You know, and what makes it different is it's really, I think about it, is it's a really chaotic archive. You've got all these materials from 2,000 years of London's past and several thousand years before that, and they are all jumbled up in no particular order on the surface of the foreshore, all kinds of materials from all kinds of contexts. And I think when you've got that kind of unique, rich, you know, incredibly varied mix of stimulus, it can take you down a far sort of more diverse set of avenues than maybe the way I would normally go about starting to create a historical story.
And Remiiya, you kind of, I guess, a kind of wider question for you about your relationship to the river and how you feel about it in kind of the river space.
Yeah, I see the Thames as a global tributary, and I've always had this sense and idea that the water goes around the world. It doesn't stay in one place. So therefore, the kind of randomness of the attrition from the river to the shore provides ample opportunities to tell a story from those objects. And I love the fact that these objects are coming from the water onto the shore. They're picked up, researched and shared. It's been like a liquid museum that has no boundary apart from the shore. So it's a different kind of democratized space. You know, we go to a museum or a gallery, there's a pane of glass there that stops you from having that intimate relationship. There's no electric fence that's going to beep if you get too close. So I think it's really important because it's not, you don't have to be a curator or a historian. All those labels kind of go out the window. So it provides a real opportunity to connect with a multi-layered, multifaceted histories, I would say, of London. And I think the River Thames is such a complex body, it's such a complex aorta of water, that you can start anywhere there and move forward. So for me, when I'm walking, I kind of just tune into the energy of that, especially in relation to identity. And my model ship is testament to that.
I'll be asking about the model ship in a moment, but we're going to come back to that, but I want to let Aleema kind of have a chance to talk about this. So again, the kind of question, so why this is valuable for kind of telling stories and how that is, it can engage people, I guess.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of a liquid museum, to make a note of that. I think my relationship is one that's thinking about, like, I guess, spatial histories and how space is often seen as something that's absent from history, as innocent from history. And I think there's something important about tuning into the spatial components of the river, of the environment, and listening to the stories that they can tell. And I think I'm similarly quite interested in this, also just the combination, or I guess the meeting point of the intangible with the intangible. So you have the emotional bodies of knowledge that comes with the river. So what it means to walk on the river, and sometimes, as you were saying, tuning into the energies of the river. But then at the same time, I feel like mudlarking, and it's only recently that I've been familiar with like mudlarking and, you know, the idea of exploring and finding and collecting objects. It brings you in conversation with the sense of possibility, the sense of exploration, the sense of imagination. And I think there's something quite important with the meeting up of these two worlds, which is often, as a historian, seen as like kind of distinct from each other. You have these ideas of fact and truth claims. And in fact, what, you know, the participation in history offers us is a chance to disrupt that a little bit. So that's, I guess that's where I'm leaning into it.
Thank you very much. And Tom, same question, but the idea about why is it valuable as a space for telling stories, do you think?
Yeah, I'd kind of forgotten the question.
Yeah, sorry.
Because I was just enjoying listening to everyone's responses, and I echo everything that's been said, you know, this idea of the archive democratizing of history and this beautiful meditation on the tangible and the intangible. I think that is the case. I mean, I've been trying to theorize mudlarking in my research as counter-heritage. So it's something that runs counter to a lot of the normative ways in which we encounter stories and also objects physical, tangible things from the past. And I think mudlarking does that in lots of different ways. Often the story, the objects we find and the stories that they tell give us something different. They tell us about stories that aren't kind of widely known, about marginalised communities, about working history, the industrial Thames, stuff like that. But also the people who are doing the mudlarking, the people themselves are often different demographically from the kinds of people who become professional historians or professional archaeologists. So it's different in the people who do it, and then the fact that they're not working in the archive, as Malcolm says, they're mudlarking, they're doing this practice which is a kind of imaginative, speculative, experiential practice. It isn't actually primarily, I think, about knowledge or history or even about objects. I think it's about having a good time, in the moment, being in the flow of it, in the zone.
Can I actually, I've just written up, I've got a whole page of notes, I've just abandoned them, basically just written any questions off the back of what you said, because it all said really interesting things. And we're definitely going to come back to talk about chaotic archive later, and I would also like to talk about counter-heritage later. But I actually want to kind of pick up on, Aleema and Remiiya, what you just said, about the river as a space, and what's it, your experience, what's it like for you actually being in that space, and actually why do you want to go there? Because I guess it's a place that lots of people that don't know anything about mudlarking, like, you want to go down to the Thames foreshore, what are you doing? Why is it that you were drawn to that space, do you think? And also, why do you keep going back? What keeps pulling you into that space? I'm just going to open that up if anyone wants to answer first, rather than inflicting that overly long question on any individual.
I think there's something about collecting. There's something about having a sense of adventure. Discovering something new. For me, it really started with walking, to be honest with you. And I was living in a place which was quite stressful, and I thought, I just need a change of air. And I started walking around Woolwich first of all, and I could just feel this shift in energy, but also being drawn to the industrial heritage of the space. And I don't know where that comes from, to be honest with you. And I thought, okay, just go along. Then I started to document it. So I started to explore where the dome, well, of course you call it O2 now, but I always refer to it as the dome. And I've always been interested in kind of social geography, terrain, and how that changes. Again, I don't know where that comes from, but I'm really drawn to that. And the river has all of that. And it pulls me back every time. I can go to the same spaces over and over again and still find something new. I'm not a mudlarker, but I collect shells, I collect bits of things on the shore. There's something that connects with inside of me, to take and think, where did this come from? How did it arrive here? I still have that kind of sense of inquiry and investigation, and I've used it in my artwork as well.
I think mine is from probably more of a personal, I guess similarly, like my entry point to the river probably started with the place that I'm from in Jamaica. So I'm from a place called Portland, which is, anyway, who knows Jamaica, Portland. I don't know if you heard of Blue Mountain Coffee, but I always say it's the champagne of coffee. So that's where I
have to prove it's the only coffee I drink.
Yeah, so if you haven't tried Blue Mountain Coffee, please do try it. But I'm from a river community. So I grew up in a place called Swift River, which is one of the main rivers that streams from the Blue Mountains. So for me, like, being close by the water has always been something that's almost like, it brings me back to my inner child. And often when I'm like doing any kind of project, I'm coming off the back of a really big project at the British Library, I say to my colleagues, I'm gonna take a walk by the river. And then when I get back, we'll make a decision. So there's something, I would say, ancestral with water and like memory and movement. And I always find myself going back near the water to just tune into the expanse. And part of that expanse sometimes is also grappling with like the histories around the River Thames, quite an unsettling history, particularly for people like myself from the Caribbean, that's attached to this kind of, I guess, a dark history, a sensitive history. So I think there's something about the river presenting these opportunities, like this call to memory, this call to heritage, but also this call for a kind of different kind of meditation that allows you to think about possibility as well as some of those unsettling dark moments as well.
So it's like a space with both operating at the same time, and you're kind of deliberately going into that space. Yeah, Tom,
Yeah, I just want to leap in on the word meditation, actually, that you mentioned. So I've been, part of my research is walking with and exploring the foreshore with mudlarks, and that word meditation has been used again and again and again. Also this idea of kind of peace and quiet and getting away from the city. But actually it's a space that isn't particularly quiet or peaceful, I would say. Maybe arguably it is, but there are a lot of sensations down there. It's a sensorium of sound and smell and things that you can touch and engage with and encounter. And all of this, I think, a lot of mudlarks anyway use this as a means of kind of clearing their mind. And some of them actually do this through formal, what you might call spiritual practices. So some of them do actually meditate. Some mudlarks that I've interviewed also pray down on the foreshore. So it's a space that feels different to the city. It's not empty of senses, it's actually quite the opposite. It's full of senses, but these are senses that kind of push our consciousness out of the everyday. Yeah, my response isn't quite as spiritual, actually. I really like Tom's idea of counter heritage, and for me, it is this sort of like place where you can kind of push against London, or where it's going, or aspects that you don't feel particularly comfortable with. And what I mean by that is, London's obviously become massively gentrified in the past few decades, especially East London, where I live after the Olympic development. And I kind of like the fact that the Thames and the foreshore is this kind of open wound, almost sort of running right through the central London. I kind of think about it as quite a dark place, really. It's kind of ripped open, it's constantly getting damaged by the wash of boats. I like kind of climbing over fences, sometimes semi-legally, to gain access to it. There's always a lot of debate within the mudlarking community about ethical mudlarking and enforcing the rules, and philosophically all that stuff makes sense. I agree with it. There's also something I really don't like about it, because to me this should be a bit chaotic. It should be slightly counter-heritage, as Tom puts it. It should be where we sort of poke at the sort of accepted rules of who gets to handle the past and own and keep objects from it. What do you do with it? And I guess I grew up being really into punk rock, and I suppose I've never really left that behind. So it's a bit of that spirit in it for me that excites me, to be honest.
And I mean, with all these questions, please feel free to kind of share examples of objects or things you found, or moments, or experiences you've had on the foreshore, because I'm sure everyone would love to hear them. So I guess with that kind of point there, do you kind of feel that a lot of the time heritage kind of creates a barrier between you and the people from the past? Like, I think someone mentioned, I can't remember who mentioned actually, but the glass case and this idea of thank you. Do you kind of feel like the objects that you kind of find and connect with allow you to connect with people in a kind of, I hesitate to say a more real way, but I guess that's the best way I can phrase it?
Yeah, I've got a lot of mixed feelings about this. So, on the one hand, yes, holding an object, it's very tangible, it's multi-sensorial. The kind of objects that you find mudlarking are generally not what you see in museums. Yeah, you might see the odd clay pipe in the Museum of London, but mudlarking gives you the broken crap, stuff the archaeologists generally aren't interested in. Virtually nothing that I've found in the past 5 years has been recorded by the Museum of London, because I'm not interested really in stuff over 300 years old. I tend to like stuff from the Empire, stuff from the 19th century, stuff from, so on and so forth. But that said, sorry, what was the second bit? That's what really interested me.
It was more just a bit about kind of the how objects we find kind of connected with people, or actually shows kind of distance with them.
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, we all put our own stories on these objects, and that is a kind of distance. Someone reads my book or goes on my Instagram, you're only getting my interpretation. It's not real. The past is gone. We've only got bits and bobs and scraps. It's all speculatory, all history writing, no matter what they might tell you at school. And so there's always a distance, but I think as a starting point it feels more immediate. I mean, I would also challenge, I don't put down mudlarking here, People often say, yeah, you could hold this thing in your hand and imagine what it was like. I would challenge that. I mean, if you read, say, the diaries of cloth merchants, for example, in the 16th, 17th century, what was going through their head, or what they recorded as going through their head, when they ran their finger over a piece of cloth, and you do occasionally find cloth on the foreshore, you can't really discern that just through holding it. You know, they've got their own sensory kind of world around a piece of cloth, its quality, what it feels like, what it's made from, that you can't, you know, so for me, the objects aren't enough. You know, you have to go and really combine it with some more conventional research, really.
Okay, so again, we'll come to this idea of heritage and the balance between heritage and mudlarking a bit later, so there is time to do that one. But I guess for everyone else, like, the objects or the space as well kind of allow you to connect with people. Would anyone else like to kind of come in on that? So pause for a second while everyone thinks about another overlong question.
I suppose you connect with modern people, like the lovely people here. If you're foreshore stompers, part of my research, I monitor a field site in Rotherhithe, which is where I live, and I go down there every week and I do some very bad measuring of things to try and understand erosion rates, but I also do people watching. I count heads and I try to work out what people are up to, how they're using the foreshore, because it's a space that is not just for mudlarks. We're like the charismatic megafauna of the foreshore, but there are many, many people. We are outnumbered in my field site, which is one of the more populous areas in Rotherhithe, by dogs. That are being walked by people and gone down on their own accord. But you know, there's a lot of people who use the foreshore, and they use it for all sorts of different reasons. A lot of people go down there for a fag break or a lunch break. Some people have barbecues on the foreshore in the summer, and a lot of people go down there, and you can just see when they're there, they're looking to have a moment out of their day and a moment of connection with somewhere that is very different to where they live or work, which I think harks back a little bit to what Malcolm said about London and gentrification and the kind of fast pace of change. So I think even though, you know, the kind of cliche of the mudlark is somebody on their own, kind of stooping over in the mud, actually we do a lot of connecting with other humans when we're down there.
Yes, I'd quite like to add to that. Also, I would agree that it's a multi-sensory experience and you are able to have some headspace. I mean, London is frenetic at the best of times. When I used to live on the Isle of Dogs, there was a particular stretch of beach, and I think it's called the London Folly. Why did it got that name, I don't know. But that particular site, people would come there and just relax, and it was like an unspoken tenet that you didn't really, it was just so calming and meditative. And I think also another important part of this is the conversations with people. I've met some really interesting characters. I've met developers who are telling me what's going to be going on in the future. I've met people on houseboats. I've met sailors. I've met ex-dockers. And when I've been drawing down there, just by sitting and drawing, I tend to sort of like attract these people and come and sit and have a conversation. So we used to live here, and we remembered all the different scents of all the spices and things that used to come in at the docks. So the conversation is just as important as well, and meeting with these different characters.
And I guess there's kind of a similar thing there in terms of almost like oral history as well, being another element of it. And I'm going to throw this a slightly different question. I'm actually going to ask Aleema directly, if that's okay. Sorry. But should we think of the Thames and the foreshore space as this kind of shared archive, even that kind of, those people are giving oral history, and that sounds very grandiose, but should we think of it in that way, as kind of this shared archival space? I know you've got a lot of experience kind of with archival and research stuff as well.
Yeah, I think I'm at a point where we're thinking a lot about archive and what is an archive and what could an archive be and who is an archive for. And I've been thinking a lot, especially in relation to this conversation tonight, about whether or not, what would it mean to see the Thames as an archive? And I think there is, I'm leaning towards saying it can be seen as this, whether or not shared archive, I'm not sure. But definitely an archive in the sense of the duality that I was kind of speaking to before. Because for me, when I think of an archive, particularly as someone from the African and Caribbean diaspora existing in the space of London and walking through the River Thames, one of the things that a lot of our work as curators and historians have to grapple with is absence, is erasure, is moving within erasure. And when you think about something like the River Thames, especially a lot of the work that I used to do at Museum of London Docklands, in relation to statues and naming and memory and colonial histories, and the Thames being, you know, at one point the gateway to empire and all of these kind of reference points to the Thames, is that duality of absence and the process of remembering often invites us to forget. And I guess I'm quite interested in that forgetting part of it. So once again, the Thames as an archive, it offers us this opportunity to explore these points of transitions, and I guess that's what I find useful in an archive. So similarly, the Thames can be used as that force of exploring these transition points, of speculating on what has happened and what could be, but also bringing us to face with some of these things, as Malcolm was saying, there isn't a methodology to do this kind of work, and I think quite often people within the academy or people within kind of history with a capital H, they're constantly searching for a methodology of like, let's classify it, let's categorize it as this thing. And in fact, the archive and this kind of work cannot really be like a methodology in that sense. It's chaotic, it's unruly, it's existing, it's moving, it's ongoing, it's contested, it's heavy, it's light, it's all of those kind of things. And I think that's where the beauty in acts of mudlarking, of doing history, which is I guess what I would kind of see in reference to the act of doing history, becomes quite important. So the Thames is an archive as much as the home is an archive, as much as your bedroom is an archive. Spaces can be seen as archives. And I think it's important for us all to rethink, you know, archive as not from a place of ownership, but as a place of knowing.
And thank you very much. Yeah, and I'm just going to segue from that straight back to Malcolm, because you kind of talked about chaotic archive before. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts on that archival idea, and what do you mean by chaotic archive for you?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. That really got me thinking, actually. No, sorry, why is it chaotic? I think several reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, just a simple jumble of material, and it's the fact that it's period, you know, normally, you know, you go and do some history in an academic context, you tend to get stuck in a fairly narrow niche, because that's just the way that world works, as we all know, in a particular time period or topic, or even far narrower than that. You know, and you know, the Thames it's really broadened my interests across periods, topics, and so on. So, I mean, I never thought I'd have a point of view on, you know, the sort of differences between how a Mesolithic knife blade was manufactured, one from the 17th century and one and you know, probably some knife that somebody used in an armed mugging last week. Have a point of view on how those three objects are made and the difference between them. So that's the first reason it's chaotic. It kind of just disrupts what you think your interests are. I think the second and most important reason for me is that it pokes at the kind of hegemonic kind of stories that get told in Britain about what Britain's history is, and this is the thing I'm most passionate about. And I think the way the foreshore does that is to reveal Britain's history as a very much a globally connected one. I mean, sure, with all of the cliches that we're a nation of immigrants, and the Romans came, and the Saxons came, and so on and so forth, but to me it goes far deeper than that, especially if you look at the past 300 years, sort of age of colonialism and empire. You know, I mean, I'll just give you one short example. For decades, like, historians that wrote about the empire sort of saw it as like a centrifugal thing. It was something that Britain did to the world, didn't really make that much difference to Britain internally. But when you go down the foreshore, you can find literally millions of material scraps of how stuff from Britain's colonies changed what we consumed, our identities, you know, our military forces, language used, many things. And I think, you know, there's been a reckoning over the past sort of 20 years, picked up obviously with the statue of Colston being toppled in Bristol a few years ago. It's been more of a reckoning and understanding the legacy of this past continues in Britain today. And it's impossible to go down the foreshore anywhere, I would suggest, and not find evidence of that. And I think that is super powerful. And I go around a lot of schools actually doing talks about this in East London where I live. And there's a bunch of kids who just think British history is nothing to do with them. You know, their parents are from Pakistan or whatever. It's like they need to know about this Tudor stuff. But then you can start to link together Britain's history with histories that they have a closer identity with, that show they're actually deeply entangled. And I think this is super powerful. It's like my number one reason why I still go to the foreshore.
Thank you. And you were kind of like nodding as well along through that. So kind of the same question to you, I guess, about this idea of this chaotic archive, and is the Thames an archive? But I would also like, I saw you nodding a bit, kind of talking about connection between local and global, and how the other kind of covers that. So I think that'd be quite interesting to hear, obviously, with your work on that as well.
Yeah, what I find really interesting is the dichotomy between an institution such as this and the actual chaos of the river. You cannot tame the Thames. It doesn't matter how much you want to carve it, cut it up or whatever, you can't do that. Where I've also worked in the museum, and having just finished a research fellowship here, you kind of understand it's a very kind of rigid structure in some ways. And then with the foreshore, you've got that freedom. You never know what's going to come up on the foreshore. I mean, I don't go into the mud, but you don't know what's going to come up on the foreshore. And I've always had a sense that the river goes around the world. And I think just by witnessing some of the mudlarking finds. So, for example, there was one mudlarker who found a power figure from the Congo. How would that get here? We don't know. But the idea that this water goes around the world and carries our stories, and also by the nature of how we've arrived here ourselves, whether we're migrants or whether we've got family here or our ancestries from all over the place, but also by the nature of the things that we consume as evidence of that. That's equally important. So I would like to say something about Timmery at this point as a symbol of that. And I'm really interested in the multiple identities of the river, and it's a multi-layered, multifaceted, aortic valve, if you like, that goes around the world. And you know, we use the word global, and I understand it, it's overused, but we are living, it's always been global, and the Thames itself is a global aortic valve. So when I came to create Timmery, and I was actually inspired by the Tall Ships Festival, and there was something that really moved me from that, but also investigating my own ancestry. And having worked myself in the Museum of Docklands and looking at some of the darker stories of the Thames, and inherent in the objects actually in those collections, some of which come on the foreshore, that led me to create Timmery. And Timmery is my model ship, and Timmery is actually an Arabic word, which means the art of the craft of man. And all the different objects that someone found on the foreshore, some from my African side, some from my Grenadian Jamaican side, it was such an intuitive process that was embodied in this structure. And also I said to myself, well, okay, I understand the stories of colonialism and enslavement, but also I'm part of that timeline, but it's not all of me. So Timmery is a testimony to that emancipation, but also honouring those ancestral rhythms of the river as well. That's very important to me as well.
And Tom, I've had a chance to answer this in general about the art, just about anything that we just talked about. Is there anything? Answer everything, please, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone here has done a PhD, I'm in that halfway slump where it seems both incredibly narrow, and then you come to an event like this and your brain just goes like this. So I don't know what to respond to, but perhaps maybe to connect something that we talked about before about space and kind of the environment at the foreshore with this idea of the Thames being, you know, this global aortic valve. I mean, one of the things I always find fascinating is not just human-made objects. We've seen some, you know, Dutch-inspired Delftware up on the screen there, but also some of the natural materials that have flowed all around the world and ended up on the Thames. I have in my on my window ledge in my living room, I've got a massive lump of coral that I found in the Thames, and this coral is not native to the Thames. It would have travelled possibly from the Caribbean, possibly from the Indian Ocean, I'm not sure, but it would have been used as ballast in one of the big ships, probably in the 18th century early 19th century. So it's completely entangled, to use that word that Malcolm used, in the global trade in goods and commodities all around the world. And I was walking along the foreshore with he describes himself as a retired mudlark, Ted Sandling, and we were talking about these bits of coral and other natural materials, and he made the point that when you're walking along the Thames foreshore, you're really simultaneously walking along the landscapes of many other places. And because of the way that natural materials get used in ballast, that could also be said of a beach in Jamaica or a beach in Goa. So it kind of speaks, I think, to Remiiya's point about the Thames kind of linking through its water all around the world.
And from that, actually, that's a really nice kind of cultural point. Do you think that mudlarking, this kind of work with the river, promotes a different sort of expertise? Because we kind of talked about the kind of traditional academia and styles of approach that I realise that I am the person that probably embodies this on the stage right now. I've been reading wills for the last 6 months. It's been quite intense. But this idea of cultural knowledge as a different form of expertise in history being increasingly valued, do you feel that this... I'll start with Tom just because you raised it, but do you feel that this kind of promotes a cultural knowledge in different forms of knowledge, in kind of forefronts different forms of knowledge? I will pass this question to everyone.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think first of all, so I use the word counter-heritage rather than anti-heritage, because I think it's important to see mudlarking and the knowledge that we as mudlarks and other river ramblers produce, not as necessarily against professional archaeology or traditional archival work. I think they can kind of run together, but it does to some extent run counter. What I've experienced interviewing lots of mudlarks is how they all bring their own backgrounds and expertise, sometimes their professional knowledge to bear on their mudlarking practice. I mean, I think there are people in the audience here who I think would be good exemplars of that. People, for example, who didn't grow up in London but grew up searching for fossils tend to be drawn to that same kind of natural material on the foreshore. So I do think there's a lovely opportunity there to create different forms of knowledge. It's not just a simple kind of, well, because they're not professional historians. It's more saying, well, who are they? What are the skills that they can bring? What is the background knowledge that they have? A good example of this would probably be when mudlarking with a chap called Alessio Ciccioni, who is a paleo something. Paleontologist. Micropaleontologist, thank you, Marie. And Alessio's perspective when you're talking about finding objects is so interesting, because if you ask somebody else, how do you find stuff? Well, I just look around here, might be around there, might be the gully, who knows? You ask Alessio, he starts talking about hydrodynamics and how the wave is hitting the rock and kind of spilling over, and that's where you'll find, and so he's a good example of where his professional expertise can actually help him find stuff and then tell stories about the things he finds.
And for everyone else, I'm just going to open this up for everyone, so please just jump in. But again, this idea of cultural knowledge being kind of forefront and being brought through much more by these kind of as a different form of history. Do you think the value of this has been changed recently? Has it been perceived differently recently? Over the last kind of say 10 years, what are people's thoughts on that? The value of cultural knowledge and how potentially how mudlarking in this kind of environments can help people bring that out?
I think what's a really interesting way of doing that is actually in these exhibition opportunities, the hands-on history events. So one took place in the Museum of Docklands, and another one was here. And I've only noticed that in the last few years, because for me at one time it felt quite separate, but having these exhibitions and having the objects on display, and also the people who collect the objects can talk about them, actually has a different kind of engagement. So people can actually hear the stories directly, but they also bring their stories as well, because they may recognise those pieces from their own past and their own ancestry. So I think in that sense, it kind of fosters a different kind of learning and a different kind of sharing as well.
So the idea of a dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to the conversation, which is also, in part a practice as well. It's not something that's on its own behind a pane of glass. There's space for both, actually. But having those objects where you can actually sometimes handle them as an experience, seeing them, for real, it gives a sense of realness to the experience. I think that's really important as well.
And you kind of sense of connection. Aleema, you're just nodding along those lines.
No, I'm nodding along because a lot of the work that I do is like looking at exhibitions as a conversation, as a dialogue, and kind of bringing. And one of the questions that I've been exploring since my unfortunate entry point into the academy, so I'm sympathising with you in the depths, remembering trying to finish my PhD, is what does it mean to know and represent within the context of our work as mudlarkers or researchers or academics, curators, artists? What is knowledge? This has been an ongoing question that I've been trying to explore probably for the last 10 years. And I remember when I initially applied to do my PhD and I presented this idea that was really engaging with I want to explore something different. I want to explore a different kind of knowledge. I want to explore a different kind of writing history, of doing history. And I remember continuously getting rejected and saying that, because the word that they often use in the academy is rigor. It's not rigorous enough. Where are the archives? Where are the facts? And I think quite often, once again, because a lot of the histories that I work on is African and Caribbean heritage histories, there's so much absence, there's so much erasure. So what does facts look like in the context of 500 years of transatlantic slavery? What's fact in that context? So, and now I've seen a change, a slight change, more of a guess of an openness. I don't know if it's just because of the areas of work that I've been working in, but I've seen this kind of willingness to explore other knowledges that have been left outside of the canon historically, other ways of knowing. And I think part of that, is not just the objects, as much as this might be a controversial thing considering this is a Mudlark event, but it's not just about the objects, as we was kind of speaking to earlier, but it's the stories, listening not being seen as this kind of one-dimensional thing, but it's multi-sensorial, listening to the emotional knowledges, the meditations, as you were speaking to, listening to the artifacts, listening to the environmental sounds, but also the people walking past and the stories that they're telling you. And I found it interesting thinking about my own relationship to how we work on the riverside in Jamaica. It's completely different, this idea of finding and collecting objects. I don't want to generalize, but it doesn't really exist there. How we do history by the riverside in Jamaica is very much, I heard so-and-so said this, and this happened here. It was in this spot that this took place. And obviously it's different because it's a smaller riverside, it's not a cosmopolitan city, but the practice of doing and learning histories has very much been carried from an oral perspective and not necessarily finding objects perspective. So I think there's I guess my point is that there's always been multiple different knowledges that feeds into understanding who we are, what we know and what we're becoming, but certain kinds of knowledges has been, erased and forgotten, but I'm kind of optimistic that there is a shift.
I just want to pick up on a point on that about oral histories. When I was doing my creative fellowship here, I had to ask myself, what is research? Is there a particular methodology? Because I'm coming into this space as an artist. I'm not coming in as an academician. I'm not coming in as a formal researcher. So the museum took a chance and they took a risk. And I also put myself, to take on that risk. And knowing that I didn't even have an agenda, I didn't have a plan, I didn't have any solid questions, but I knew Timmery had led me here. So I thought, okay, we're going to follow her instructions and see where she takes me. So I had the opportunity to listen to some oral history. So I think there's been a big change in the value of oral history, especially from a Caribbean and African context where stories are told and that information is passed on from one generation to the next. It's not necessarily written down. Now we have devices where we can record things anywhere we want at any time. It's not just a cassette player anymore or a little dictaphone. We've got our phones now, so we can record those stories. So that was really essential, hearing the stories of merchant seamen in Africa that was recorded by staff here in the Maritime Museum to give a completely different picture about how people related to the water. And one guy, his name is Rudy, I can't remember his surname unfortunately, Remy, sorry, his name is Remy, it's very similar to my name. He learned how to knit while he was on, in the Merchant Navy. He learned how to do watercolour, and I just thought, wow, I wouldn't have known that had I not listened to these stories. I've noticed now in museums, we've got more access to oral histories to get a real empathetic sense of how people lived. and how that relates to where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that getting your hands on the kind of objects you find on the foreshore leads to the creation of different kinds of knowledge. And I think it's interesting that quite a few times already in discussion, people sort of said, well, you don't have to be a professional historian to handle these objects, but the interesting thing about that is that historians completely ignored objects until quite recently, to be honest. That was a distinction between historians and archaeologists. Archaeologists use things, historians use written stuff, not even pictures, to be honest, to any great extent. So, one thing I think mudlarking kind of frees objects from the sort of confines of the archaeologist. Now, if there's any archaeologists here, I'm not knocking archaeology, I did a bit of it at university, but archaeology puts a particular lens on objects. If you look at the books that have been written by archaeologists about stuff from the Thames, they tend to classify them, be very focused on the primary use of the object, how it was made. I'm generally not that interested in that stuff. For instance, in my own book, I've got a couple of sections where I talk about how a candlestick was a metaphor for prostitution in popular pamphlets and songs in the 16th century. And I think in one review the book got somebody thought this was slightly spurious, but why not? I mean, I spent most of my sort of day job working in advertising, which is all about putting stories around innate objects, thoughts, feelings, associations, metaphors. And if you think about pretty much anything that you own, you don't just use it, it's not just about its primary purpose. It's all sorts of associations and emotions that get attached to these things. So I'm more interested in what the objects tell me about that, to be honest, than the way an archaeologist would look at it, that it's come from a specific site, it's used for these purposes. To me, that's kind of science. I'm not a scientist, I'm rubbish at science. I'm definitely a sort of storytelling humanities person in that respect.
And I guess that kind of, sorry Toby, do you want to come in? You look ready to go there? So
yeah, possibly. I mean, I sort of wanted to respond to the idea of categorisation, but also firstly to say that I think there are many kinds of mudlark, and there are many kinds of knowledge and history that could be produced from the foreshore, and some of it is very object-based, some of it's very story-based, a lot of it is kind of constantly oscillating between the two. But I want at some point, maybe this is not the moment, to share an object that I've got from the Thames, which is a kind of anti-mudlarking object.
I kind of feel like you have to share it.
I kind of have to share it, I put you on the spot. If you say no, there will be riots. It's not that, it is interesting, but it's not beautiful. So it's this lump here. I'm going to slightly, I think I can do that actually, there we go. So this is called the Rotherhithe conglomerate, because I found it in Rotherhithe, and it's a conglomerate. And as you can see, it's basically just a lump of stuff. Now, this kind of conglomerate is really common on the Thames foreshore. Yes, you can, yeah. Just be aware of not doing that. I was about a second too late there. Do you want to pass it back and I'll put it back in?
Yeah, I will pass it back.
Okay.
So some of you got them.
Yeah. It does, that's the point. So,
hopefully.
so this conglomerate, it interests me because it is lots of different materials all bound together through being in the river a long time. You've got brick, you've got stone, you've got shell, you've got glass, there's coal on the back as well, and some kind of organic matter. It's all been bound together through metal, through rusting iron. And what I love about this object is that it's basically lots of things that are kind of dying. They're all objects that are returning to their kind of material state. And yet, through that process, they've become bound into something which is new. So for me, I like the symbol of it. It symbolises the kind of processes of regeneration that happen down the river. And the thing that dropped out is the thing that actually brought my attention to, because I wouldn't have seen it otherwise, and that is a complete Victorian button. And these are really common on the Thames. But the fact that it was just embedded there, it kind of brings the whole thing together in a way, a complete object that hasn't decayed yet, stuck inside this conglomerate of decaying objects.
Yeah, sorry Tom, just one very quick build on that. So that kind of really challenges the idea of classification and the distinctiveness of kind of objects. The Thames just fuses all sorts of weird stuff together. I love that. It creates these sort of whatever you know what I'm trying to say, hybrid objects, and I love that.
Absolutely. It's probably my favourite object from the Thames. So unless I find a pilgrim's badge, and then that will be
no pressure. But so yeah, I guess actually from that, you're kind of both talking about the idea of stories, and I guess actually the oral history is kind of part of that as well in terms of oral traditions and using stories to tell history. How do you feel that you are, when you're looking at an object or connecting with kind of foreshore, you are part of a story, or do you feel that you're telling a story? Do you feel that when you use an object, you're kind of, are you giving that object a life with a story that you're telling, or is the object kind of, how do you feel the relationship between, I guess, Mudlarker, person on foreshore, and the space kind of operates in terms of that storytelling? Because I hope that makes sense as a question, but that idea of, you know, are we putting the stories into these objects, or are we kind of picking up the stories from them, and how, I guess it's both, but how does that balance exist for you? I'll leave everyone to have a second to think, and please someone pick up your microphone.
I'll have a go, because I think about this all the time, actually. It's one of my sort of, there's a real tension for me in this. Like, you know, because obviously there are standards, if you've ever been involved in academic history, you know, of the claims you make and are they adequately supported? Is there enough rigour, to use that word, in a sort of conventional sense? But on the other hand, you know, I think it's been generally accepted for a long time now that all history is speculatory. There's no real absolute historical truth. We can't recover the past as it really was, as somebody said 100 odd years ago. We're never going to be able to do that. And so every bit of historical writing is speculatory. It does reflect our needs in the present, the needs of the person very much that created it, but at the same time you feel this urge to remain true to an object or the person or who used it. So it is this kind of tug of war in my head, really. But I'll make no bones about it. You know, most of the stories that I create around the objects are there to serve some sort of political purpose. I won't mince around, typically around some sort of social justice issue. Read anything I write on Instagram or essays or anything, that tends to be what it does, but all history has done that, really, whether it's, in my opinion, whether the author acknowledges it or is conscious of it or not. It all works like that, so embrace it. I do.
I think it's a bit of both. I'm not a mudlarker, but I do collect things, and the objects have their own story, and I think it's our challenge to find that story. But we are also the conduits to communicate that story, whether it be through art, whether it be through poetry, whether it be through a historical piece of writing. It's how we engage with our audiences. And also, there are no absolutes. You know, you can cross-reference in books, you can go online, it's not always up to date. It also, the different stories from people who may see the object as well, they have a personal connection. There's always that chance of that happening too. So I think you have to be quite holistic and open-minded about it, and knowing somewhere along the line you might find something else that goes with that object. So that it's like a sort of like a two-way relationship. If you find the object, it's going to lead you to find a particular story, and then how you tell that story is going to be just adding to it. So it's almost like the object's got its own canon, and you add to it over time.
And I think that's what the power of thinking about the archive in this kind of way is, because it's ongoing. There's always this conversation around the archive as this thing of the past, as this thing that's static. It doesn't move. Even the same, I guess, could be applying to how we think about heritage. We don't really talk about heritage as much as we talk about culture. We talk about culture a lot. When it comes to heritage, it's like, oh, that's tradition. That's something that cannot be moved. It cannot. So I'm always quite interested in thinking about how do we liberate some of our ideas around what heritage is as an ongoing conversation that is very much about the past as it is about the present and the future. And I think that's what I find working in exhibitions and working as a curator quite interesting, because very different from some of my work where I'm writing about particular archives or objects. When you're curating or when you're putting something in a case, it assumes a new character. And you're also having to think about, once again, I think about exhibitions, as I was saying, as a conversation. Like, who am I in conversation with? What do I want the audience to know? What conversation am I inviting to tell them? And some stories change depending on where the object is exhibited. So to put forward something in a community centre might be different from putting forward something at, the British Museum. What's the story that the British Museum should tell, or the National Maritime Museum should tell, as opposed to, the Black Cultural Archives, etc., etc. So the story changes also depending on who you're in conversation with, and I guess what it is you're trying to represent. And once again, we go back to this question of what does it mean to know and represent within the context of this work. But I think ultimately is one that's ongoing. It's continuously changing and evolving and unfolding, and I think that's what makes it so beautiful.
Thank you. And yeah, Tom.
I love that, absolutely love that, and I think the idea of objects being kind of liberated from that idea of kind of fixed value system in history is really important. I mean, even within the museums and kind of formal heritage sector, they are kind of scratching their heads about what they think about objects and whether objects matter and whether they value, and they've got storeroom after storeroom full of stuff that is apparently priceless, but also no one cares about it. So there's a kind of ongoing question in the heritage industry around value. What objects do we care about? What do we leave behind? What do we kind of shine a spotlight on? And what I like about what Mudlarks have the ability to do is to go, we're just going to go with our nose here. We're just going to follow our own particular interests and tastes and background, and create our own kind of personal curations of things that in themselves may be short-lived. I've interviewed lots of Mudlarks who used to pick up one object and now they don't like them and they pick up something else. And Mudlarks may also fall in and out of love with their hobby. So that kind of way of valuing objects is very subjective, it's very dynamic, and trying to break out of, I've been thinking of the idea of value being in feedback loops at the moment. So that thing where you say, oh, isn't that chair amazing? They go, oh, yeah, you're right, it is amazing. And then by the end of the evening, we're all trying to buy the chair, and it's just a chair. So trying to break out of those loops of thinking the same thing is valuable again and again, and we have it even within mudlarking. So this apparently kind of disruptive hobby, there are certain objects that get more attention than others, I think just because they are in its kind of tradition. Clay pipes being a very obvious one.
And I mean, I guess the classic case example you're talking about is the kind of, as soon as the object goes into a glass case, we're expected to go, oh, it's in the case, and look at it. But is this kind of, we mentioned this earlier, counter heritage, is this kind of how that kind of, could you say a bit more about that in terms of, is that kind of what you're talking about there, or are you thinking of something slightly different? Or?
Yes, partly. I mean, partly I'm talking about, well, I think with counter heritage, I'm also talking about the stories. So quite a lot of what all the other panelists have mentioned in terms of the kinds of stories that mudlarking can tell that run perhaps counter to some of the kind of normative histories that we learned at school. Having said that, a lot of those normative histories are no longer normative because history is ever changing, and so sometimes, ironically, mudlarks, by actually telling extremely small micro stories about a particular glaze that was used in 1650, is actually also a counter heritage because no one else is interested in it. I know I'm slightly going around in circles at the moment, but I think it is about stories and it is about objects as well, and it is about the kind of glass case mentality. There's a sensuousness to being down on the river and holding objects. I also think sometimes it's not about collecting the objects; it's about encountering them in that space. And famously, archaeologists used to say that there was no context in finds from the Thames, by which they mean archaeological context. So a find can be dated and it can be compared to other features and other objects and structures within the archaeological site, and that the Thames is all kind of mixed up. And to some extent that's true, although there is also stratigraphy on the Thames. There are layers of objects in certain places. But what I like to think of is that the encounter with objects that mudlarks have on the river, and also subsequently, and I think this pertains to your idea of the mudlark being a conduit, what happens to objects when they come off the river and, for example, meet people in exhibitions or get taken around schools. All of this is a different kind of context. It's not archaeological context, but it is adding a layer of knowledge and information to the objects.
And sorry, just to pick up one thing you said there, the object meets people. Are we kind of giving these objects and filling in these objects with a life of their own, do we think? So that's a very grand question. Yeah.
This is sending me right into the heart of my struggles with my thesis at the moment. I'm thinking of Jane Bennett's theory of vibrant matter and the kind of general turn in academia towards giving objects agency. And I don't know.
Okay.
Someone else please answer.
I mean, I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible because it does my head in still, but I really like the idea. I've really discovered the idea of objects having agency through mudlarking. What that means basically is we tend to think of objects as things that humans make and we control them and we decide how they're going to affect the world, but once we've created them, they also have an effect on us too. I mean, just to give you one example, in the 18th century, window glass that you could actually see through was invented. It was invented so people could get more light into their houses, but it also then gave rise to whole new ideas about privacy, and I'm not going to waffle on about that, but it's quite an interesting bit of history. So objects affect us as much as we think we affect them. And I'm really interested, it never occurred to me until I started mudlarking. So I always like to ask sort of what does the object deserve credit for? So I always use the object of a tin can, right? I mean, I don't know any other mudlarkers apart from me pick up tin cans. I know a few that kick them out the way and throw them away, but tin cans like totally blow my mind. If you look into the history of them, just this sort of like fairly straightforward invention to preserve food, did many, many things. It expanded the British Empire because suddenly we could keep people alive in the middle of jungles who didn't know how to, colonists I should say, didn't really know how to find food there. We could pretty much take over most of South America through investing in canning plants and bringing all of that stuff back, changing the diet of people, and blah, blah, blah. And, this wasn't really the intent of the tin can when it was invented, but then it sort of took on this life of its own. So I've kind of become mildly obsessed with the agency of objects, although I don't claim to fully understand it still.
Any tin can fans in the room, you don't speak to.
I think I always had, it's something that they speak about a lot in like museums and the heritage sector, particularly recently. Like there's this whole project that's like unlocking the potential of our collections, and it's something that troubles me a lot because I think, ultimately it is about us as people and the stories that we're telling and the stories that we're finding connections within these objects. And I think one of the things that I find troubling within this work of heritage, of working within heritage, is some of the tensions around preservation and care, and when does care become violence is something that I've been meditating on most recently. So you might have a plant, and if you water the plant too much, the plant dies. I've been a terrible plant mom, but do you know what I mean? At the moments where it's like we think that we're caring for something by protecting it. So a lot of the work that I do working within the community, for instance, a recent Beyond the Baseline exhibition, one of the exhibition opened with a drum, which was from a Nyabingi community group. And when he saw that his drum was in a case, he was so hurt by the fact that it was in a case, and there was a lot of arguments between the loans team and the lender, because he's like, free the drum, liberate the drum, don't lock it up in a case. Why are you putting my drum in a case? And they're like, well, no, it's insurance and da-da-da-da-da. And he's like, if you want my drum, it can't be in a case. So it was this whole, moment of thinking that what we're doing is we're trying to protect the drum. We're trying to make sure it's temperature checked and insurance and all of this stuff. When actually who the drum belongs to wants this drum to be touched. It wants people to engage with it. So I feel like a lot of the tensions in the work that we do as curators, as researchers, heritage professionals, that tension between preservation and caring for things, and that fine line between care and violence.
guess actually that kind of leads into maybe something to kind of, we're almost out of time, and actually we'll do some questions in a moment, so you have questions, you will have a chance in a second. But this idea of potentially moving beyond and mudlarking moving beyond the foreshore, which is an example that all of you have been examples of people who have done this. Is that a problem in that way with that case? Is that a problem? Do we lose something by stepping out of that? Because we started off this conversation talking about kind of almost in a spiritual sense about the foreshore. How can that be shared beyond that space and encourage people to connect with that in understanding the object? And is it an authentic experience of that object without that kind of environment? What do we does anyone want to kind of respond to that?
I think again it's very subjective, and different people are going to want to have different experiences with those objects. Some of the people that I interview are real collectors. They have a particular specialism and they want to collect that specialism. So when you see those objects presented in an exhibition, you're going to see a whole pile or a kind of very beautifully classified box full of tokens or pipes or whatever the object type is, which of course is completely inauthentic to how it's found, because it's that chaotic environment that Malcolm was talking about at the start of the panel discussion. Personally, I feel that there's something. I did an exhibition last weekend at St Paul's, and I laid all my stuff out on the table, and I looked at it and I thought, they're all dead. They're not animated. For me, the objects are alive when you find them on the river, when they're in that state of kind of flow and sort of decay and new life. But that's just me. Other people have a real passion for collecting, and I wouldn't knock it.
I'd like to share just a sort of similar experience when I was doing my research. A lot of the archives and collections that are online through various systems, and I found myself scrolling through but not feeling any kind of connection whatsoever. I was looking at all these model ships and collections at Chatham, and I thought, and maps and various objects, and I didn't have any, there's an interface there that was stopping me. And I often have this experience when I go to exhibitions. But you also have the opportunity to order the objects and have a look at them close up. But again, there's another protocol to go through for that. But once you get there, it's just a completely different experience. It's something like your human energy suddenly connects to the object, and you start to feel, it's quite emotional, but also triggers off lots of creative ideas. So I was doing some work in Kidbrooke, PPMC, the Prince Philip Maritime Collection Centre, that's it. I was going to say Kidbrooke. And I looked at some flags. Now these flags were about 10 feet by like 5 feet. They were huge. But online, it's like a little tiny picture, and there's a description, and that's, I'm not knocking it, I'm saying that's important. But when you see the object in the flesh, and you smell that object, and you connect to the stories, and that triggered off a whole conversation, and that's also part of the process. So I was looking at a flag from the so-called Great Benin Expedition, and at the same time, the curators were saying to me that they had some dignitaries from Harvard who came to see that same flag, and I was saying, well, why is that still here? So it's, it invites conversation, it invites further research, and that's my own personal story in terms of I can't just look at things on the screen, I have to have that intimate relationship and connection to it. And with regards to mudlarking, I think it challenges all those norms, but also invites new ways of working with objects, showing them, preserving them if you want, or putting them back into the Thames. I think you don't have that preciousness. I think you engage with it in the moment, and you can appreciate it and share that story. You've got avenues now to share that online or in a book or wherever you want to do it. That magic is really important.
And Aleema, on that kind of idea of moving beyond but maintaining.
I think ultimately what we're talking about is like a living, it's a living heritage. It's alive. I'm saying to Remiiya that I'm working on this chapter that I'm writing of museums are a place that history dies. Because this is really the challenge, the glass cases, the protocols, the administration, all of the things, isms and schisms that you have to do as a curator or a researcher, anyone engaging with that space to actually be in conversation with the object, means by the time you get there, like, I'm tired. Like, I can't even, I don't even know what I'm doing. I don't even know where I am. So the challenge is like, how can we keep it alive? How can we keep that connection there, even in these spaces that a lot of these spaces weren't necessarily designed for the kind of work or the kind of audiences and the communities that we're trying to engage with. How do we keep the history alive? And obviously that's through sound, that's through the ethereal, that's through the scent and all of the sensories. But I think this for me is my entry point into mudlarking. I mean, I'm not a mudlarker, but I find that chaos and that living element of it so interesting, that the openness, the flexibility, but also that imagination, the speculation, and the expanse of it. It's continuously ongoing, and I think that's something that museums and heritage spaces are still struggling with.
Place of categorization and control rather than chaos, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So, just building on what Tom said, I used to have all of my finds in these glass cases, sort of roughly ordered by type of object, and then a couple of weeks ago, I'm like, no, you've got it all wrong. So I threw away all the labels. It took me ages to write, basically weeks. Threw them all away, and just pretty much randomly organised all of this stuff in whatever order I fancied, to be honest. I feel so much better, because I feel more alive again. There's more of a connection between how I encountered these things and the kind of chaos and randomness of how you actually go mudlarking. You're going to find it's a McDonald's straw from 1988. You know, someone will think that's quite cool in 100 years' time to find that, when plastic straws are considered a weird aberration of the 20th century. You know, so I kind of
I think it's quite cool now. Sorry.
I started to make it chaotic again, and then my only other thought that you said about keeping objects alive is objects that are made out of certain materials, so iron which rusts, leather, wood. It's like having children, you know, trying to stop these things crumbling into dust when, you know, I'm not a professional music professional, far from it. Honestly, I felt like I've got like 10 more children. I'm constantly checking these buckets of water to see where this 16th century shoe bears any resemblance to a shoe. So, yeah, they're not inert, these things. They require a lot of looking after.
I know that there are certain mudlarks who actually put leather shoe soles they're trying to restore. They put them in the in the cistern bit of your toilet.
Yeah.
Because it'll be constantly running water, which is what it needs. But apparently that is also used by professional archaeologists, so that's okay.
And on that bombshell, I say thank you very much to our panel, and we will now open up the floor. If anyone has any questions, my colleague Aleema has a microphone. We have a few down the front here, and yeah, please direct your questions to the panel.
Hi there, great talk. Tom, I'm going to aim something at you. You mentioned the word hobby. Can mudlarking move beyond being a hobby? And how could it?
Gosh, good question. I don't think it necessarily needs to or should do. I mean, a hobby has a bit of a bad kind of press as a word. I don't think it needs to. I think we all need more hobbies in our lives. I think COVID, if anything, has taught us that. In terms of moving beyond a hobby, I guess you're thinking about the kind of professionalisation element of mudlarking. Yes and no. I think the most instructive figure here is Ivor Noel Hume, who is often thought of as the kind of godfather of modern mudlarking. He wrote a book called Treasures of the Thames in the mid-1950s. He became a professional archaeologist, but he was a mudlark first. So that route from mudlark to professional archaeologist has a precedent in him. But I don't think it has to. There are some limiting factors on the level of professionalisation that mudlarks might acquire. One of them is the big kind of the elephant in the room around ownership of the foreshore primarily, and of the objects on the foreshore. It is owned by the Port of London Authority, and mudlarks are licensed, and therefore making money out of mudlarking is quite difficult. There are some examples of people who have and do, but they are pretty rare. I don't know if that answers your question. If there was something else you were angling at.
I was just trying to see where it could go to for sort of a greater, wider acceptance, I guess, moving beyond that hobbyist sort of feel.
To some extent, I I love the kind of engagement aspect of mudlarking. Personally, I would love to be able to give tours of the foreshore to children. I see a lot of school groups going down to the river, mostly probably without a licence. I think that should be formalised. I think there should be more opportunities, whether it's through an organisation like Thames Explorer Trust or Thames Discovery Programme or some other way. I would love to see more access to the foreshore generally, and of course objects are part of that, an important part. But I'd also return a little bit to what Malcolm said at the start, which is that there is something a bit illicit about mudlarking, and I also would not want to take that away. I also get that thrill from clambering down ladders at night.
Also, on the schools thing, as someone that has led 30 school children down to the foreshore and seen them being given a briefing about rat urine, that is a joy. So I reckon more children on the foreshore, please, but yeah, safely with the briefings.
It's interesting because I recently worked with a school and they were actually studying mudlarking, and I thought that's amazing. I've never come across that before. It's on their kind of curriculum, and so we did I brought in some bottles with Bessemer stories in it, which I borrowed from another mudlarker, and another mudlarker who just recently published a book on mudlarking as well. So the children were absolutely thrilled. So I got them to make their own messages in bottles and think about objects and what does it mean to have your own personal archive and things like that. And for me, that was a game changer in terms of history. You know, it was contemporary, it was fresh, it was engaging, and they had agency over their work. Some put instructions in there, some put games in there, they made their own objects and put them in there, and they also had a trip down to the foreshore as well, so it was really taken quite seriously, and it was really refreshing.
It's really wonderful. Okay, next question, please.
I think that's me. Hi. So I'm quite new to London. I've been here for 3 months or so, and so this whole idea of mudlarking is fascinating. But before I came here, I had heard of mudlarking from far away Australia, but from nowhere else in the world am I aware of anything of a similar tradition. And is that just my ignorance that there is a similar tradition in other cities, or if there isn't a tradition, why London?
Yeah, London's got some particularly unique conditions that lend themselves to mudlarking. So, you've got a tidal river that you're allowed to access safely, with a lot of stuff still lying around in it that's interesting, and you're allowed to go and do it. And when I was writing my book, the publisher was like, yeah, we want a couple of pages at the end about mudlarking around the world. I was like, oh God. And it's quite hard to find that precise mix of conditions, like the Seine, for example. It's not tidal. You can't go down and look in it. But that said, I think there are, and social media sort of reveals this fairly quickly as well, there are sort of people practicing sort of mudlarking or mudlarking adjacent kind of stuff pretty much everywhere. There's a guy who goes out into the bush in South Africa to old gold mining sites and finds similar kinds of stuff that have been preserved by the dryness of the environment in Australia. I've seen some people doing similar stuff. I think there's a couple of people in Sydney Harbour, on the Great Lakes, in the Midwest, in Vancouver, the conditions might be slightly different, maybe less tidal than the Thames, but there are people doing similar things, although they may not call it mudlarking in a lot of places.
Holland.
Yeah, Holland and Belgium actually they find very similar things to the stuff that turns up in London, looking in the mud that is dug out of canals, say in Amsterdam, when they are dredged.
Well, you just said it also put me in mind of, as a place in Perth, Western Australia, the Shipwreck Museum, which is just, it's really interesting, but it's all the ships that were wrecked on that coast and things that have been washed ashore and investigated, which is
Beachcombing is as old as the hills, and that's kind of what it is.
Oh, there's one here.
Hi, thank you so much. Your talks have been absolutely fascinating. So I've got a couple of questions, if I may, please. So I'm curious about your Georgian skeleton key that's on the display. What do you think that opened? And then my second question is, if you could mudlark on any river in the world, where would you like to go?
Like, the key's mine. I'm fiddling around with this thing that's really annoying. The key's mine. Probably a door. I'm looking to Monica and someone else to back me up. I don't know. What do I think? A door. I think a door. I don't know technically actually what it opened. I will never know.
How big
But
is it?
it's about that big, that long. It's a typical skeleton key. Maybe like a larder or a pantry, I don't know. I like to think that, the key symbolism is unlocking stories, unlocking people, unlocking worlds. So it's quite with the opportunity every time you go down to Mudlark, there's always opportunity for stories and amazing finds. Not always historic. So yeah, it's just furthers that wonder. And I can't remember what the second bit was.
Second part of the question was, where in the world would you like to? We're going to magically implant a river with the properties of the Thames into another city, so you can mudlark in this other city. So, if you don't mind me slightly changing the question, is there a place you would like to do that?
Recently, the beginning of bit of last year, I went to Uganda, and I had the opportunity to go to the source of the Nile. And on the Nile, there's lots of different shrines, and there's a bit of, there's some jetties and things like that, and I think that's what I would like to, it's a little town called Ginger. I think I'd like to explore around there, especially where the Nile's meet, the blue and the white Nile.
I grew up in southeast London, and on the banks of the River Effra, which some people might know from Effra Road and the Effra pub and so on and so forth. In fact, I wrote a book about London's lost rivers. The Effra mouth no longer comes out into the Thames, it's a tributary of the Thames. So my answer would be the River Effra. I would go into the Victorian sewer and I would mudlark in the sewer. Although it wouldn't be called mudlarking, it would be called toshing, which is the old kind of 19th century word for going into sewers.
As another Southeast London, it wasn't always a sewer.
It was a river.
It was a river.
It was a natural river. Yeah.
Aleema, you kind of mentioned a river earlier in that space. Like, you can just repeat your answer
Yeah,
earlier if you
I
want.
think so. Yeah, I'm like, this event has probably inspired me to go mudlarking. I'm going to Jamaica this weekend actually, so I might try my first hand at mudlarking back home, see what I might find.
I'm going to be really boring and say the river about 150 yards from where you're sitting now, because I've done all sorts of poking around in various different places. I used to live in the States and did a bit of digging toilet pits called privies that you get in the backyards of the brownstone houses. I've found a few bits and pieces, but Thames is by far the best place I've ever gone looking for bits and bobs from the past.
Thames, Deptford, foreshore. Move on.
So I'm really interested about the archiving of things. On the Thames, we find what the bog standard average person uses on a day-to-day basis. But when you go into a museum, what you tend to see behind the glass is the most beautiful example. And the reason, or like even shoes, you'll find the size 3 that was never worn by anyone, that was nice and small and compact and could be sold and taken around to show people because it was so small. And yet what we find quite often is the absolute detritus, the cheapest bog standard shoe, the cheapest toilets, chamber pots. And recently, I was talking to a guy called Oliphant, is his surname, I can't remember his first name. Peter, that's it, Peter Oliphant. He's just written a book about marbles, and he was saying there are only 6 of these marbles. He's absolutely obsessive, one of the obsessive mudlarks. And he knows everything there is to know about clay marbles, but he was saying there are only 6 recorded on the PAS because they're particularly special. So all his knowledge about marbles isn't recorded in any written archive, so he's just done this book. So I wanted to ask you what you think about the commonplace on the foreshore.
Can I respond almost by just talking about the PAS? So for people who don't know, the PAS stands for Portable Antiquities Scheme. And in a sense, it is an online, it's a digital archive of objects found by 90-something% detectorists, but also mudlarks. So mudlarks have a responsibility to have the most significant finds recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme website. And it's a fantastic scheme. It's actually a great way of keeping a lot of this heritage living, to use the word we've used before. but it is incredibly biased in lots of different ways, particularly towards metal objects and particularly towards kind of rareness and also age. So those things that we find as mudlarks, we find fascinating, which tell, you know, stories about social history and, you know, the exchange of cheap stuff, cheap commodities all over the world, including marbles and other things. Those tend to get left off the portable antiquity scheme. So it's a way in which, you know, archives can be used in quite a biased way. And again, another reason why I think mudlarking is important.
I think the challenge is always down to this treacherous word that means nothing outside of the heritage sector, but like provenance. And this is like one of the main challenges. I've worked on contemporary collecting projects at the Museum of London, and you know, part of the challenges is that we have these objects that has these very rich social histories and stories and narratives connected to them. But what's the provenance? What's the facts? What's the truth? And once again, it's the history with the capital H and the heritage with the capital H that's coming to once again show its dominance. And because of that, it means that quite often a lot of the random things that can be found that actually have very powerful connections to understand society are quite often left out of what gets in and collected as part of a museum's collection. But yeah, provenance is killing us.
Yeah, it kind of harks back to an event that was held at the University of Greenwich a few weeks ago, and they were looking at statues and the fine line between statues and sculptures, but also what do we memorialise, what do we leave behind, and you know, and who is in charge of that story, who holds the narrative and why, especially in the light of when statues were taken down from Colson and even to the Mulligan statue outside the Museum of Docklands. So it is a difficult area, but they still hold value. And so it's like the difference between having an exhibition of mudlarking work and having something that's behind a glass cage. There's a space in between that. But those stories are just as important, and maybe there needs to be another way of having that as a continuous sharing.
I echo Tom's point actually about the portable antiquity scheme. Like, I love it, and I'm very, very glad that it exists. But the fact that nothing pretty much within the past 300 years is recorded, I think, is a huge weakness. A lot of it's to do with resources. I just don't have enough people to record this stuff. But you know, to me, that's where the real juice is, the sort of untold story. So, for example, a friend of mine, he found a badge from the first British fascist organisation in the 1920s, and he found it literally 100 yards from where their headquarters had been in Fulham. And, you know, most people think of history of fascism as Oswald Mosley, 1930s, but actually an aristocratic woman, very influenced by Mussolini, started the first fascist organisation in Britain. And this kind of pushes back. If everyone knew this story, you'd actually think, no, we didn't just have this brief flirtation for a few years in the 1930s. It actually goes back decades, and, you know, these badges are incredibly rare. I don't think another one exists, but no, it's only 100 years old. It's not recorded, and I have my issues with that.
Exceptions? Don't they not allow exceptions for things? Rarely.
Sorry, Monica.
Don't they normally allow exceptions for things that are particularly rare? That didn't get.
I think there are some exceptions, but I just have a difference of opinion on what the exceptions are. But it's no one's fault, really, because it's one person trying to record thousands of things that they have to prioritise in line with the objectives of the scheme overall. So you just need more resources, in my opinion.
Okay, that is unfortunately all we have time for tonight. So I say join me in saying a massive thank you to our panel.